All right, Cinzia, now I'm going to address that portion of question number 3 about Columbus being accused of poor administration. Nothing could be further from the truth. So let's begin with the fact that Columbus was no politician. Let's view what is to come through that lens, all right? And this sounds like I'm starting off with an apology to soften the blow of some bad news, but it's not actually. In fact, what you're about to see is that Columbus was a great governor, and that he is only made all the more great by the fact that he was no politician. He had no formal training in politics. He had no experience with politicians, except he was a sailor, and we'll come back to that. A cartographer, a scientist, a dreamer, but not a politician. And yet, he established peaceful first contact with the islanders, both friendly and otherwise, created the first permanent European settlements in the Americas, forged lifelong friendships with Taino chieftains, protected the islanders from enslavement by the hidalgos, the low-landed nobles of Spain who wanted to enforce Spain's feudal encomienda system on the Tainos, defeated multiple rebellions by the hidalgos using arbitration rather than armaments. He brought what I call the Pax Columbiana to the West Indies, in which, quote, things were calm, the land was rich, and everyone lived in peace, end quote. And he unseated the villainous Viceroy Bobadilla, who unleashed a reign of terror on the West Indies, and he successfully lobbied for the first civil rights legislation of the Americas, ensuring that, quote, all the Indians of Hispaniola were to be left free, not subject to servitude, unmolested and unharmed, and allowed to live like freemen under law, just like any other in the Kingdom of Castile, end quote. So are these the marks of a poor administrator, of a poor governor? So let's take a look at where his remarkable ability to govern, despite no experience in politics, might have come from. Now, I've compiled a list for you. And to quote Nigel Tufnell from the hilarious movie Spinal Tap, this goes to 11, this list. So we'll begin with his God-given attributes. So number 1, the Cardinal of Spain, who would come to know Columbus through his landlord, expressed that he was impressed by the Genoans, quote, fair speech and learning, and, quote, good intelligence and great knowledge, end quote. Now, Bartolomé de las Casas, the author of many of the primary historical sources and first-hand accounts of the settlement of the West Indies, and a biographer of sorts of Columbus, described the admiral as having an, quote, unusual insight into human and divine affairs, end quote, and good judgment. This is from Book 1 of Historia de las Indias. So already Columbus had the makings of a fine leader. Number 2, Columbus was an experienced sea captain, and his crews were commonly made up of low men. Now, in this still savage age, unless a captain intended to press men into service against their wills, which Columbus did not do, assembling a crew for a ship usually involved setting up a table in some tavern and taking the names of anyone willing to lay down their life for a long and dangerous ocean voyage. Those that took the job were usually covertly running from something, if not religious persecution, then a death sentence or trial for murder, rape, or some other crime, a debtor seeking significant recompense, or an unhappy family life with a difficult spouse or parent. So that meant that most crewmen were secretly troubled, difficult men at best, and hardened criminals at worst. As a seasoned sailor, Admiral Columbus knew how to deal with an unruly crew of low men. This certainly built up his leadership skills in a crucible. No modern politician, nor any of Columbus's day that I know of, had to deal directly, face to face, on a daily basis with desperate, starving men. Columbus did. And this lifetime of experience honed his leadership skills. Number 3, Columbus spent over a decade of his life dealing with merchant barons, dukes, kings and other princes in his attempt to find a sponsor for his proposal to sail westward to China, which was mocked as a preposterous joke. His proposal was rejected by his own Genoans. They feared that if he were successful, they would lose their trade monopoly over the Mediterranean, the only developed route to the Silk Road. And the Portuguese. King João actually stole Columbus's maps and charts and delivered them to his own fleet to set sail without Columbus until, by divine providence, a storm crippled the Portuguese fleet and sent them listing back to shore. These failures early in his endeavor taught him much about dealing not only with low men, but with nobles. He learned how to apply his remarkable people skills to all social strata in the age of empires. The Spanish crown refused him as well. The court counselors and treasurers exhorted the king and queen to reject this pauper and send him away, but Columbus was canny and, despite not being a politician, had a sharp politic mind. He won over the queen with a clever suggestion: an alliance between Spain and the Great Khan of China. Columbus suggested that the legendary military might of the Great Khan might help launch a two-front attack against the jihadists who had, for 700 years, occupied Europe until Spain's recent unification. He suggested that with the help of the Great Khan, the Spaniards could drive the jihadists out of Europe altogether and perhaps even liberate Jerusalem from them for all of Christendom. Now, in this master stroke of diplomacy, in the face of continued discouragement from the Crown's trusted court advisors, the mark of a poor governor? No. Columbus had the makings of political greatness, and he would go on to realize them. Number 4. The first glimpse of his capability for foreign diplomacy came on his first voyage. Columbus made peaceful and propitious first contact with the islanders of San Salvador. In the 2 months that followed, he visited at least a dozen more islands, repeatedly and without exception, making friends and allies with every single tribe and every single village he met on every inhabited island he visited. And you can find this in Bartolomé de las Casas' writings, the digest of Columbus's logbook, and so forth. Upon his departure from the West Indies to return to Spain, his flotilla was attacked by cannibalistic Carib marauders armed with poisoned arrows. Rather than return hostilities, Columbus welcomed the man-eating chieftain, High King Caonabo, painted head to toe in black war paint, aboard the Nina, where, facing down the admiral, the High King made a, quote, a speech as fierce as his appearance, as described by Bartolomé de las Casas in History of the Indies, Book 1, Chapter 36. Admiral Columbus served him a meal, not of human flesh, bestowed gifts upon him, and, through his new Taino translators, worked a diplomatic miracle, completely diffusing the confrontation. Admiral Columbus sent the warmongering chieftain back to shore, accompanied by a small cadre of sailors, who then bartered with the rest of the war party. Now let that sink in for a moment. Few instances of first contact in history have proceeded without bloodshed or loss of life. Admiral Columbus, he was not yet governor, managed to negotiate first contact with at least a dozen tribes of the West Indies, including hostile, cannibalistic canoemen who twice attacked him and his crew, and without a single fatality, sowed goodwill and friendship in every port. Are those remarkable foreign diplomacy skills the mark of a poor administrator, a poor governor? Hardly. And then he thought ahead. Politically speaking, he worried about vassals of the Great Khan or subsequent European settlers from other nations, the Portuguese, for example, arriving in the wake of the Spaniards only to enslave the tribal peoples. He encouraged all of the islanders he met to receive baptism, rendering them immune from enslavement by any who would seek to apply the repartimiento to the tribal people of the West Indies, that part of the feudal encomienda system of Spain that entitled medieval Spanish nobles to subject conquered enemies to servitude. Politically, Columbus was far ahead of his time. He was already thinking outside of the medieval paradigm. Now, I cannot emphasize enough the milieu in which Columbus achieved all of this. This unique, self-educated genius managed to defy not only the primitive ideologies of his time, but also the sizable warmongering political forces that opposed him, and accomplished all his unparalleled deeds in the face of them. And he hadn't even been appointed governor yet. Number 5. On his second voyage, he arrived as Don Cristoforo, new governor of the West Indies and all lands he should discover. He was no engineer, civil or mechanical, yet his first official act was to begin building a new settlement. He and the crews of his 17-ship fleet constructed irrigation canals, mills, water wheels, and farms with many vegetables. This was not his expertise, though there were undoubtedly builders sent with him on the 17 ships that comprised his second fleet. Think about that for a moment. 17 ships. That's an enormous amount of people under his command, at sea, in close quarters, for weeks and weeks. He had to manage the logistics of a 17-ship fleet, attend to all problems and concerns, while still navigating, only for the second time, uncharted transatlantic waters that few could survive. These skills translated well into the establishment and management of a land-bound settlement. Number 6. Even as he oversaw the construction of the settlement, he managed both domestic and foreign relations with great aplomb. Taino caciques, or chieftains, of many tribes and their womenfolk frequented the settlement, bringing yams, quote, nourishing and greatly restoring the Spaniards, who were grateful for the assistance. And this is written in Hernando Colón's book, The Life of the Admiral, chapters 63 to 64, and also in the letter of Diego Chanca, Dr. Diego Chanca, the fleet's surgeon. Could a poor governor manage all this while still excelling at human relations with those who did not even speak the same language? No. A poor administrator, he was not. Number 7. My respective colleague said that Columbus was an, quote, overly permissive governor. Now, with all due respect, the evidence flatly contradicts that. The hidalgos made up of entirely of nobles, entitled nobles no less, who refused to toil, or who were themselves pardoned criminals who agreed to help settle the inhospitable tropical frontier, and thus, as criminals were too indolent to toil, insisted on enslaving the islanders to build the settlement. Columbus refused to allow it, demonstrating himself not only to be a keen governor of both blue bloods and bloodletters simultaneously, but a moral governor. So many of the hidalgos plotted, quote, to raise a revolt and load themselves with gold, as they were exasperated and discontented from the labor of building the town. This is straight out of The Life of the Admiral by Hernando Colón, chapter 51. And so began the discontent that would forever drive a wedge between the entitled Spanish hidalgos and their low-born foreign governor, Christopher Columbus. Again, I exhort you to keep this in mind as you listen to all of the subsequent accomplishments I'm about to relate to you. Christopher Columbus achieved them all, not in an atmosphere of cooperation from his subjects, but in the face of their constant defiance and enmity and rebellion, born of their own arrogance and high-born entitlement, or criminal shiftlessness. Number 8. Columbus not only oversaw the building of an entire settlement for the occupants of a 17-ship fleet, but simultaneously oversaw the construction of a distant fort to protect the settlement. When he returned to the settlement, and in his absence from the fort, a tribe of islanders robbed the fort and the fort's captain and the captain's men. The captain, a man named Pedro Margarite, captured the robbers and cut off their ears in retaliation. Margarite then brought the maimed prisoners of war to the settlement before Governor Columbus for further punishment. But Columbus was horrified by Marguerite's treatment of them, again exhibiting the good judgment and unusual insight into human and divine affairs that de las Casas described of him in Historia de las Indias, Book 1, Chapter 3. Instead, Governor Columbus used the same clever intrigue on the islanders' chieftain as he often used on the King and Queen of Spain. He told the chieftain that the punishment for the robber's crime was death, though Governor Columbus had no intention of ever carrying out that threat. When the chieftain heard the pronouncement, he offered a tearful apology for his villagers' misdeeds. Columbus immediately set the robbers free into the custody of their chieftain and announced to Fort Captain Margarite that the matter was settled. Basta, chiuso. Or he probably said in a heavy Genoan accent, bastante, cerrado. This comes from History of the Indies, Book 1, Chapter 93. Again, Christopher Columbus's clever diplomacy won the day without a further drop of blood shed. But that story doesn't end there. No sooner had Governor Columbus adeptly resolved this matter did horsemen arrive from the fort, informing that the islanders had surrounded it and attempted to kill its occupants. In Columbus's absence from the fort, and without his pacifying presence, the relationship of the settlers there and the nearby islanders soured terribly. De las Casas points out, he makes a point to note this. He says, quote, "I would not dare blame the admiral's intentions for the discord, for I knew him well, and I know his intentions were good." And that's from Chapter 93 of History of the Indies. Once again, Governor Columbus shed no blood over the incident. He sent cavaliers to make only a show of their arms and horses, and to instill fear into the tribal warriors responsible for the siege. That is straight out of the same source by Bartolomé de las Casas, who was there at the settlement to witness all of this. The tactic successfully scared the warriors off with no fatalities, liberating the besieged Spaniards. And we know that from the book Life of the Admiral by Hernando Colón, Chapter 53. So not only did Columbus demonstrate a keen political mind and superb diplomacy skills, he knew how to engage in subtle yet peaceful intrigue to keep his men and those who would be hostile to them in line. No poor administrator is capable of such feats. Later, a band of tribal marauders led by tribal warlord Guatigana descended upon the protective fort, murdered 10 settlers in cold blood, and set fire to a hospital containing 40 patients. Columbus's son, Hernando, notes that the tribal warriors, quote, would have killed many more if the admiral had not arrived in time to prevent them, end quote. And that's from Chapter 61 of Life of the Admiral. The Spaniards' men-at-arms caught some of Guatigana's murderous warriors, but again, Governor Columbus exhibited temperance. He did not presume to try, much less punish the attackers, but rather delivered the prisoners to the crown to have their day in court. So add to the list of feats of this so-called failed administrator or poor administrator the ability to swiftly de-escalate an already hostile and deadly situation while still exhibiting a sense of modern, not medieval, justice. Again, he was ahead of his time in affairs of governance. Number 9. Thereafter, although the settlers still struggled with food scarcity and disease, the Christians', quote, fortunes became extremely prosperous, end quote. That's from Chapter 62 of Life of the Admiral by Hernando Colón. And peace reigned supreme under Columbus's gubernatorial administration, as he was loved for it by the tribal people, if not by the chagrined hidalgos. Quote, indeed, the Indians would carry Columbus on their shoulders in the way they carry letters, end quote. I'm not sure if that means men of letters, like, you know, you're going to celebrate somebody who's very prominent, you carry him on your shoulders, or like the way you would carry a sack of letters, you know, from the ship to the settlement, letters from home, you know, that kind of thing. But either way, in gratitude and in brotherhood, the Taínos led the settlers to their own copper mines and revealed to the settlers the locations of precious gemstones such as sapphires, ebony, and amber, spices such as incense, cinnamon, ginger, and red pepper, and gums and woods such as cedar, Brazil wood, and evergreen mulberry. This is all in chapter 62 of Life of the Admiral. Above all of these master strokes of governance, Columbus enhanced trade and peaceful commerce between the Spanish and the tribal settlements. And yet, Governor and High Admiral Columbus maintained a humility through it all. Quote, "The admiral attributed this peace to God's providence," end quote, also from the same source, not to his own doing. And he was only partway through his administration as governor of the West Indies, and he had already freed the Taino slaves from captivity by the cannibalistic Caribs, overseen the building of multiple settlements in harmonious coexistence with their tribal neighbors, and defeated the Caribs' marauders, bringing peace and slowly restoring prosperity to the land. He brought to the West Indies what I call the Pax Columbiana, as his very name suggests, Colombo, Italian for dove, the symbol of peace. Still, the Hidalgos wanted slaves of the islanders. The more they received, the more they wanted. These are the people, greedy, immoral opportunists, with whom the weary sea captain had to contend. Let's not forget that. He did all of this while never desiring to be governor to begin with, and wanting only to, quote, "escape from governing these dissolute people full of vice and malice," end quote. That's from Christopher Columbus's letter to Doña Juana de Torres, dated October of 1500. Last but not least, number 10. Well, actually, I said this goes to 11, so we've got 2 more left. Number 10, Governor Columbus quelled no less than 3 rebellions by the Hidalgos, led by Alonso de Ojeda, Fray Bernardo Buil, and his co-conspirator Captain Pedro Margarite. You may remember him from the tribal robbers incident in item number 8, and Juan Aguado, and finally restored peace and prosperity to the West Indies. But while still in the throes of these many rebellions, Governor Columbus had written to the crown, beseeching them to send him someone the Hidalgos would respect and obey. And on a dark day in history, the crown sent Comendador Francisco de Bobadilla, Dark Knight of Calatrava, the true villain of the West Indies. The crown told Bobadilla to see what all the conflicting letters were about. Columbus was sending missive after missive complaining about the recalcitrant Hidalgos, and the Hidalgos were sending letters complaining about the alleged tyranny of this low-born authority over true people of quality, such as themselves. The monarchs told Bobadilla, sort it all out. And if he did find that Columbus was a miserable governor, then to unseat him and take the perpetually hereditary title for himself. Well, that was all Bobadilla needed to hear. The first thing he did upon landfall was to ally with his fellow nobles and imprison Columbus and his brothers in the bowels of a prison ship, with no investigation, no evidence but the calumny of the Hidalgos, and no due process. He then sent Columbus back to Spain, where Columbus soundly defeated all the false charges Bobadilla had levied against him, and secured the unseating of Bobadilla to boot. But that took time. Consider what Bobadilla did during that time, and more importantly, in Columbus's absence. If you're still not convinced that Columbus constantly engaged in Herculean and successful efforts in maintaining the delicate balance of governing the West Indies, let what happened in his absence be the final nail in the coffin of the argument that he was a poor governor. In Christopher Columbus's absence, Bobadilla and his Hidalgos enslaved, raped, and murdered tribal people, sometimes simply on a whim and as cruel jokes. Bobadilla's men, who considered the Taínos as no better than dogs, plundered their villages with impunity. Young Bartolomé de las Casas, who witnessed these atrocities firsthand, would later note that without Governor Columbus to keep the Hidalgos in check, quote, "they grew more conceited every day and fell into greater arrogance, presumption, and contempt towards these humble islanders, end quote. Now, without Christopher Columbus's humane governance and the strict discipline that he had imposed on the Hidalgos, they became, quote, soulless, blind, and godless, as Bartolomé de las Casas describes them. They, quote, killed without restraint and perversely abused the tribal peoples of the West Indies. And that's from Book 2, Chapter 1 of History of the Indies. With Bobadilla's usurpation from Christopher Columbus of the governorship, the viceroyship of the West Indies, the encomienda, as well as Bobadilla's own personal brand of murderous tyranny, reigned supreme. Now, if you still think Columbus vacillated between being overly permissive and overly severe, consider this. Quote, the Spaniards loved and adored Bobadilla in exchange for such favors, help, and advice because they knew how much freer they were now than under Columbus, end quote. That's from Historia de las Indias, Book 2, Chapter 1. But Bobadilla's constituents were only freer at the cost of nearly wiping out the tribal people. That was a calamity that Columbus's gubernatorial prowess had successfully avoided. Yet, Christopher Columbus bore no hubris and afterward wrote with humility about his ability to govern, despite that he had proven himself to be the greatest governor the West Indies had ever seen under Ferdinand and Isabella's rule, if not the greatest governor the West Indies has ever seen to date. Despite having freed the Taino slaves, built multiple settlements, and defeated the Carib marauders, bringing prosperity and a Pax Colombiana to the land, he lamented about the naive trust he had placed in the Hidalgos to respect his authority. Though he governed better than most politicians who had the luxury of ruling a civilized people, he admonished future critics that he should not be, quote, judged as if I were a governor in Sicily or of a well-regulated town or city, end quote, where the social fabric is intact and the laws are, quote, observed in their entirety, end quote. Rather, he wrote, quote, I should be judged as a captain who left Spain for the Indies and found himself unwittingly in a warlike nation with no towns or governments, end quote. All the while opposed by villainous hidalgos and conquistadors who imposed upon him, quote, the ingratitude of injuries, end quote. That's from Historia de las Indias, Book 1, Chapter 181. These are fair and wise words that modern critics are quick to forget. And I hasten to point out that when he talks about an uncivilized people, he's referring to the hidalgos. So, his political prowess also did not end with the end of his gubernatorial administration. Here's Nigel's number 11. Though Christopher Columbus was not trained as a lawyer or a legislator, once he was back in civilian life, Columbus carefully drafted a petition to the crown that he hoped would protect the tribal peoples from any further depredations by the Spanish governors. A petition for the first civil rights legislation of the Americas. This act by Christopher Columbus marked a milestone, not only in the life of this genuine mariner, and not only in the history of the Americas, but in the history of worldwide civil rights. Historian and translator Andrea M. Collar noted that Christopher Columbus ignited what was to be the undoing of the feudal encomienda system. Could a poor political mind do that? Could a poor administrator do that? She suggests that Columbus's championing of the civil rights of the tribal people sparked the spread of, quote, the enlightened Spanish legal tradition, first set forth in what was called the Siete Partidas. That's Spanish for 7 parts. This is found in Historia de las Indias, the editor's introduction by Professor Collar. The Siete Partidas was a 7-part, as the name implies, Castilian statutory code, first compiled in the 13th century during the reign of Alfonso X, establishing a uniform body of normative rules for the kingdom akin to the Magna Carta or the American Bill of Rights. Christopher Columbus sought to extend these civil rights protections from the Siete Partidas to the tribal peoples of the West Indies. In other words, Columbus not only changed the world, he changed the law, and for the better. No poor governor could single-handedly do that. In fact, few capable lawyers even could. The widowed King Ferdinand of Spain read Columbus's petition for the civil rights legislation and agreed with him. Now, I hasten to point out that King Ferdinand was no fan of Columbus. I think he sensed that his late wife, Isabella, had had a crush on Columbus. Now, they never acted on that crush, but she gave Columbus anything he asked for, and she was the one who called him back when the king and all the king's counselors and all the king's men were saying, don't fund this guy's crazy science experiment. So even though at this time, when he's petitioning the crown for the civil rights legislation, his biggest fan, Isabella, is deceased, the king, who was, as I said, no fan of Columbus to begin with, nevertheless granted Columbus's petition and promulgated the first civil rights legislation of the Americas. This royal decree from the Crown of Spain included, quote, a very specific clause, end quote, at Christopher Columbus's behest, and it read as follows: all the Indians of Hispaniola were to be left free, not subject to servitude, unmolested and unharmed, and allowed to live like freemen under law, just like any other vassal in the kingdom of Castile. End quote. You can find that in Book 2 of History of the Indies, Chapter 83. So, whatever treachery the Hidalgos might plan this time under the governorship of Bobadilla's successor, Nicolas Ovando, Christopher Columbus saw to it that the tribal peoples of the West Indies would now have the protection of law, as mandated by two kings, the worldly and the heavenly. Columbus had not only the capability to captain low men and govern blue bloods, he had the political prowess to change the minds of monarchs and change the law of the land for the better. A poor administrator? Hardly. That's it.